Hey everybody, I'm here to talk about Mama Day by Gloria and Naylor because I've just finished this book. It is the 1st of March and I just feel like if I wait until the end of March to talk about this in my wrap-up, I'm just gonna not be able to make any sense of my thoughts anymore, or I will just have forgotten too much about it because my memory sucks. So Mama Day is a modern classic. It's a book that is published at the end of the 80s in my birth year, 1988, by an African-American woman called Gloria Naylor. This is a book that is mainly about the relationship between two people, Coco and George. However, it very closely ties to the background of Coco. Coco comes from a town in the south that is referred to as Willow Springs. However, this is a town that basically has sort of like no state that claims it. There are two states that it kind of sits between. I'm not entirely sure anymore what those two states were, but in any case, there's no state really claiming them. They are not paying taxes to any state, which also means that no state is really helping them out when it comes to disasters, to infrastructure or anything like that. So it is really a community that is standing on its own and that is basically taking care of its own as well. It is connected to the mainland through one particular bridge, a bridge that was last destroyed in a big storm in the 1920s, and that was then rebuilt by the community itself. This place that Coco comes from is a place that is steeped in history, steeped in tradition, and in tradition that is more sort of like linked to the African heritage of the people who live there, and has to do a lot more with sort of like spirituality. The town of Willow Springs has this sort of like origin myth or like story at its foundation of this white slave owner who was enthralled by a black slave that he owned, who, or it kind of says like he never really owned her. I guess potentially he did like physically own her, but like he was never able to really be her master because she was too much of an independent woman to ever be ruled in that way. But so she was able to kind of overcome his mastery and get him to deed the town to his descendants, which means that this family, the Day family, basically has a big role within this community. The whole founding myth of this town comes from the family of the Days, and so they are basically at the front and center of this particular town. So Coco comes from a background that is very much steeped in spirituality, in a closeness to nature, a link to ancestry, and so a much less rational viewpoint than your modern day American living in the sort of like landscape of the 80s. She meets this guy George, and their relationship isn't like immediately off to a great start, for example, but there is this immediate attraction between them, and both of them kind of seem to, or at least George definitely seems to realize that, you know, like this is the one for him. But, you know, we see their relationship develop, but they are coming from two very different places, because George is actually somebody who is broken off from his history, his family, because he's the son of a prostitute. However, his mother, I assume, passed away, or maybe she gave him up. I don't really remember that part of it. But basically he grew up as an orphan in an orphanage, and he was raised there by this caretaker who very much focused on facts, the facts of life, and dealing with the facts in front of you in order to get ahead. She was not really, you know, allowing them to fantasize or, you know, to like dream of better days or anything like that. She was very much instilling them to look at the present, to look at the why of things, and to kind of try and improve a situation based on rational thought. So get your hands dirty, get going, do all the things that you need to do in order to improve your situation, but do it because of being presented with certain facts and knowing what actions you can take to move those facts into the direction that you want to take. So George has a very rational, science-based view on life. He is an engineer. He very much knows how to take care of things, and this is a part of his character traits that Coco's family will very much value and appreciate is the fact that, you know, he is very much hands-on, he gets things done, he doesn't, you know, like sit around wallow in the reality of things, because he's always been taught like life is harsh, you have to roll with the punches, and so he gets things done, and that is a very positive side. But what we will see throughout this book is that, especially in the second half of the book, when George finally visits Willow Springs together with Coco, that his rationality will start to clash with the spirituality of this place, and that the more that the plotline kind of goes into the spiritual realm, the less certain, the more insecure George will become, because his grasp on the situation will be cut loose. Basically, he will try to see things in a rational way, he will try to make sense of what is happening around him, but he does not have the frame of reference to understand the spiritual forces that are at play here in Willow Springs. And so that's in a large part, I guess, what this book is about. This book is very much focusing on this community of Willow Springs, which is a very tight-knit community, as it is a community that is standing apart from the rest of the United States. The sort of like traditions and practices that they perform are very much unique to that particular place. They are very much isolated from the outside world because they only have that connection through the bridge, and so as a consequence a very unique society has been able to build over there. But it also means, as I said earlier, that they are standing on their own, that they are very much relying on their own. And so the character of Mama Day, who is basically the sister of Coco's grandmother, is basically sort of like spiritual leader, I would almost say, of this town, and she's also the one who they can rely upon to help them out in medical situations. They do have a doctor that sometimes comes from over the bridge, but Mama Day is there for the sort of like immediate response and for helping them out, and her knowledge comes from tradition, from knowledge that has been passed down through the generations, and is much more spiritually linked than modern medical knowledge is. And you know, she is at the center of this town and of this community, which is a community that very much takes care of the people within the community. It is very much a loving community. However, we do see some strife that occurs, especially throughout this book, where we see that there is one particular woman who will start to use this spiritual, traditional sort of like powers for bad things rather than for the good things, the way that Mama Day is using them. And that is where the powers of the spiritual will be clashing with the powers of the rational later on within this novel. And so we see this woman who is using the faith and reliance that people have within this communal bond and kind of using that against people, using them to do harm rather than to help people along. Whereas for the most part, when we're looking at community interactions, we definitely see that there is sort of like a loving community. We have this one character, for example, who is called Dr. Buzzard, and he basically, in his mind, he's doing like a service that Mama Day is performing. You know, he's giving medicine to the people, but the medicine that he's giving is basically in the form of alcohol or sort of like concoctions he makes that are often sort of like alcohol based, and that he's kind of selling them, and then the placebo effect is basically coming into effect. If these people just believe, then they will get better because of the fact that he has sold them this particular concoctions as being a cure. And so we see some conflict there between Mama Day and Dr. Buzzard, because she doesn't consider what he's doing as medicine at all, and so she's very offended whenever somebody lumps them in sort of like the same area of expertise. However, she's also relying on him at certain points throughout the book. She will, at the sort of like culminating piece in this book, definitely be reliable upon him, trying to get him to be a little bit of a cornerstone, a bridge point between her world and the world of George, the rational world of George. But there's also, for example, but this Dr. Buzzard, for example, also is a crook who isn't just selling like fake medicine, he's also cheating at cards the entire time. And I love that scene in which we see sort of like a game of cards with all of the locals and then the newcomer, George. And all of the townsfolk are basically just sort of like, they know what's going on. They know that Dr. Buzzard is basically always just cheating during cards, and they are resigned to the fact that they will be losing some money, but they play with such low stakes that they don't really care. It is more about coming together, having a good time together, and you know, the joke and the fun for them is just being in on the fact that this is happening. They accept this, and this is sort of like an inside joke, let's say. And George kind of completely disrupts that you know, like that atmosphere that is hanging around this card game, because he is so rational, and he has basically specialized in game theory in one of his classes, and so he wants to use his rational knowledge to kind of beat Dr. Buzzard. And I like how in this scene you see both George's sort of like commitments to beating Dr. Buzzard, but also how he ultimately feels defeated by Dr. Buzzard, because even though he ends up beating Dr. Buzzard and getting the money, he definitely can sense that he's kind of disrupted this whole thing that people have going on, and that ultimately Dr. Buzzard still has one-upped him somehow, you know? But so yeah, it's a very tight-knit community that will come together to overcome certain obstacles, such as bridges breaking down, but also to protect the people within the community for the most part, except for this one woman that I told you guys about earlier. And one thing that is also probably of interest to talk about is a place that is referred to as the other place on this island. So as I said, it's a tight-knit community, it is a small community, but there's also this one place on the island that is isolated from everything else and is referred to as the other place. The other place feels like it has some sort of a magical power over the town, but it is also a place of taboo, place that is not really talked about. It is mentioned at times, but it seems to create some anxiety or some sort of discomfort when it is mentioned. And we first hear about the other place when we have this woman called Bernice, who's trying to have a baby, and Mama Day has been trying to help her out, like making drinks for her that will help, you know, prepare her body for pregnancy, and it's just telling Bernice, like, you just have to be patient, it will come, I've prepared you as good as possible. However, Bernice kind of sees that Mama Day could be doing more if she would just like go to the other place and get things done. So this other place takes on this sort of like mythical power status, and as we go through the novel we find out more about this place, which is actually sort of like the house in which the white man that is their ancestor was living, and the place of trauma for the family day, because there are a lot of family members who have passed away in this house. There's a well that has been boarded off because one of the family members committed suicide in there, for example. So it is a place that holds a lot of trauma, but it also holds a lot of power through that trauma. So it is a place isolated from the community because of its sense of trauma and history, but it is also integral to the community, to the history that they share. And so most of this book seems to be, or feels like, it is about the weight of history, but also the importance of history. History is something that they are carrying with them, that they are passing on from generation to generation, not in a written form, but in an oral sort of like family myth type of way, and it connects them to who they are, to their sense of self, to their sense of community. And George is then the contrast to that, because George does not have these stories about his family, his roots, where he came from, and he therefore has always been taught to rely on himself and to rely on facts, and as a consequence he stands very much isolated from this community. And I think it was very interesting to see the evolution of George with the town, because when George is first kind of like made it to the town, which is only happening in the second half of this novel, he is like quickly enraptured with this place that is like a place of beauty, where the lives that are being led are very much more simple than the lives that he has been seeing all of his life, that he has been confronted with throughout his life. These are people who are living much closer to nature, who are self-sufficient, and he, being a little bit of a hands-on person, does see a lot of value in that and kind of wants this for him and for his wife and for their future children. However, Coco does not really see this. She's like, this is a place of the past, this is a place that holds no real future for us, you know, what are you going to become, a chicken farmer? And then we slowly see conflict rising between George and Coco, and there's this storm that's coming towards the second half of the novel that will actually basically kind of trap them in this town. And I thought it was really interesting to see, you know, the evolution of George from wanting to stay there and fighting Coco in his wish to be able to settle down there and have a life there, to the points in which he will be desperately trying to leave this place, trying to get across this broken bridge in order to reach modern life, modern comforts, modern knowledge, modern skills. And so yeah, I think it's a very fascinating novel. It's a fascinating novel that you cannot just like easily digest or interpret. There's no like one-to-one relationship between these sort of like magical realist things taking place and what they represent or what they are a manifestation of, which is a sign of a real magical realist novel. I mean, if you followed me for a while, you might know that I have a little bit of an issue with the label magical realism being put on too many things, but this is what magical realism is. It is a use of the unexplained in order to explore post-colonial themes, in order to explore colonialism and colonialist harm. It is usually it is a way to write about the unexplainable, to manifest what cannot be explained, what can only be felt or experienced. And so yeah, I think that this was a great magical realist novel. I did not always have the best of times with this particular book. I went through it very slowly. There were sections of it that worked way better for me than others. In the first, basically what also definitely didn't help me is that it only has like 2 very long chapters. I am somebody who thrives off of a short chapter in order to just like propel me forward. It's not like I cannot then read like 10 chapters, for example, if I have a short chapter, but just the fact of like finishing a chapter and going into the next one just like kind of like propels me forward. Whereas when I'm seeing at the top of my e-reader like, you're on page 10 of 150 in this chapter, that does not propel me forward. And aside from that, this is a novel that for the longest time it feels directionless. Like within my explanation of this book, within my discussion of this book, I've mainly been talking about that final section of the novel, and that is because for such a long time within this book we are laying groundworks, but it's very unclear whether there is a plot line and what that plot line is, where we are going towards. And that is also something that, you know, I mean, I can deal with and I can like a book that has done that, but it is something that I'm gonna be kind of struggling against or struggling through, because it is not something that's going to push me through the story. So in that first half, what was kind of pushing me through the story was just seeing the relationship between George and Coco develop. I did very much enjoy their relationship. I know that it had its ups and downs definitely, but I enjoyed kind of seeing the dynamic between the two of them and seeing them kind of get to go together after a pretty rocky start. And then in that second novel, that second half of the novel, definitely events were pushing me forward. Once we kind of got once we got around the time of the hurricane, then I was definitely on a roll with this story and moving forward from there on. And yeah, I would definitely say some other things that I really enjoyed about this book were the relationships between Coco and her grandmother and the sister of her grandmother, Mama Day, because this is a sort of like unconditional love but also tough love type of deal. They love each other unconditionally, they love each other true and true, and they know each other true and true, but that does not mean that there's any sort of like coddling between either one of them. You know, Mama Day definitely somebody who comes out and speaks truth and says things as they are and is not, you know, like trying to comfort Coco by, you know, like giving her false expectations or just kind of like telling her what she wants to hear. She will tell her, you know, what she needs to hear. And that especially comes from the fact that Mama Day has this very clear sort of like gut feeling about things. She has this instinct, this intuition that is very much linked to her spiritual powers and her spiritual link to the islands, where she will kind of see what events needs to take place in order to get the ball rolling. So for example, she is kind of responsible for Coco getting a job in the beginning of the book, and kind of Coco thinks like her grandmother basically gave her the wrong advice, because her grandmother basically tells her at some point after a job interview, like, you know, you might think that you didn't get it, but you know, just write a letter. It might do more than you think. And Coco is always assuming that that letter did nothing, but actually George forwarded that letter to another company that he knew was hiring, and so she ends up getting a job based off of Mama Day's recommendation. So things didn't really pan out the way that Mama Day maybe had expected or had thoughts was like the logical conclusion from her advice, but it does ultimately lead to where Coco needs to be. So yeah, I enjoyed this novel. There's a lot in here that can be unpacked. There's a lot in here to explore. Definitely the sort of role of nature within this, for example, could definitely be another angle to look at this book for. But I thought it was really interesting, and even though I took my sweet time with this one and it wasn't always easy to get through, I do definitely think that it is one that is very layered and very interesting to explore and to look at once you have completed it. So yeah, let me know if you've read Mama Day, what your opinion are about it, and yeah, I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Bye!